This is part 2 of our series on the Civil War. And I'll be honest with you, when I was loading up the destinations for this one, I kept adding figures to see. Because the people who shaped this war between 1861 and 1862, they are wild.
All right, last time, we stood in the smoke at Bull Run. We watched a war that everyone thought would be over in 90 days collapse into something nobody was prepared for. And I promised you, this is where it gets complicated. September 1861. Robert E. Lee is not yet the legend. He hasn't earned that yet. Right now, he's a general the Confederacy is betting huge on, and he is about to get completely embarrassed by a man most people have never heard of. Meet Nathan Kimball, a doctor before the war, a volunteer colonel from Indiana who had no business stopping one of the most celebrated military minds in American history. And yet that is exactly what he did. Lee's plan at Cheat Mountain was aggressive and smart on paper. A 5-column surprise attack through the West Virginia wilderness. He had the numbers, he had the terrain, he had surprise. What he didn't have was execution. His columns got lost, communication broke down, and Kimball, holding a fortified position with a fraction of Lee's men, repelled every advance.
Lee retreated. The Southern press crucified him, and they called him Granny Lee. They called him cautious, ineffective, a disappointment.
Here's why this matters. If Cheat Mountain goes differently, if Lee wins this one, if he builds confidence and momentum early, does the Confederacy put him in a bigger role sooner? Does he get to Richmond before McClellan arrives? We'll never know, because Nathan Kimball said no. Edward Dickinson Baker was a sitting United States Senator from Oregon. He was Abraham Lincoln's closest friend, the man Lincoln named his son after. And in October 1861, Edward Baker strapped on a uniform, rode out to Ball's Bluff, Virginia, and got himself killed in combat. He is the only sitting U.S. Senator to be killed in combat in American history. Let that sink in for a second. The Battle of Ball's Bluff was a catastrophe. Union forces crossed the Potomac in a poorly planned operation, got pinned against the riverbank, and were slaughtered trying to retreat. Bodies floated downriver past Washington. The capital was horrified. Congress's response was immediate and lasting. They created the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, a congressional oversight body that would spend the next 4 years second-guessing, interrogating, and sometimes outright humiliating Union generals. Some historians blame this committee for wrecking careers and distorting strategy. Others say it was necessary accountability. Either way, it exists because Edward Baker rode out that day and didn't come back. His death hit Lincoln harder than almost anything in the early war. The man never really talked about it publicly. Some grief is too close.
Okay, now I want to talk about someone who I think is genuinely one of the most consequential people of the entire war, and not in the way he wanted to be.
Alan Pinkerton. You've heard the name. His agency is still around. We Never Sleep, the I logo. That's him. In the fall of 1861, General George McClellan hired Pinkerton as his intelligence chief, and Pinkerton was legitimately good at parts of this job. He broke up Confederate spy rings in Washington. He ran counterintelligence that the Union desperately needed. But here's the problem. When it came to estimating Confederate troop strengths, Pinkerton was a disaster. He consistently, catastrophically inflated Confederate numbers. He told McClellan the Confederates had 150,000 troops when they often had half that, sometimes less. And McClellan, who already wanted an excuse not to attack, took those numbers as gospel. Every time Lincoln pushed him to move, McClellan pointed to Pinkerton's reports. The best trained, best equipped army the Union had ever assembled sat in camp. for months. The Confederate General Joseph Johnston reportedly said Pinkerton did more for the Confederate cause than most of their own officers. This is John Scobell, and what he pulled off makes most of the spy stories you've heard seem small. Scobell was a formerly enslaved man. Pinkerton recruited him in the fall of 1861, and look, for everything I just said about Pinkerton getting the big picture wrong, this was one thing he got extraordinarily right. Scobell could do what white Union operatives physically could not. White spies behind Confederate lines had to explain themselves. Every single encounter. Scobell was treated as beneath notice, and he weaponized that. He worked as a laborer, a cook, a traveling musician. He had a beautiful singing voice, and Confederate officers loved having him entertain at camp. Imagine the intel you gather when the generals don't even stop to think about you. He reported troop movements, supply shortages, morale, the fortifications around Leesburg, the reinforcements coming up from the Carolinas. Real, actionable, correct intelligence. The Civil War was not just fought between North and South. Inside Indian Territory, what we now call Oklahoma, it was also a civil war within nations. And one of the most extraordinary people of the entire era was an elderly Muskogee Creek chief named Opothleyahola. The Confederacy pressured the 5 civilized tribes hard to ally with them. Many did, for complicated reasons rooted in treaties the U.S. government had already broken. Opothleyahola refused. More than that, he gathered nearly 10,000 loyalists: Creek, Seminole, Cherokee, freedmen. Runaway enslaved people who had fled to Indian Territory. And in the dead of winter 1861, he led them north, on foot, toward Kansas, toward what they hoped was Union protection. Confederate and pro-Confederate native forces pursued them through 3 brutal engagements in the winter of 1861. Opothleyahola people fought them off each time, but with each battle they lost more people, more supplies, more horses. By the time they staggered into Kansas, they were frostbitten, starving, and many were wounded. The Union's response? Shamefully inadequate. The government left thousands of refugees in miserable conditions through that winter. Opothleyahola himself died within 2 years, never returning home. The people who followed him paid an enormous price simply for refusing to be on the wrong side of history. This story almost never makes it into mainstream Civil War discussions. It should. While Pinkerton's bad numbers kept the Eastern Army frozen in Washington, a cigar-chewing brigadier general nobody had heard of was, quietly, in the Western Theater, just winning. Ulysses S. Grant. February 1862. The entire Confederate defensive line in the West was anchored on 2 forts, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. If those forts hold, the line holds. If they fall, both rivers become Union highways into the heart of the South. Grant looked at this map and said, "Let's take both. This week." Fort Henry, February 6th. Built so badly the fort was literally underwater. Andrew Foote's ironclads bombarded it for 2 hours and the Confederates surrendered. 2 hours. Grant didn't even pause. Marched 12 miles through winter mud to Donelson. Donelson was a real fort. 17,000 Confederates, 3 generals. The ironclads got mauled this time. Confederate guns firing down from the bluffs tore the fleet apart. So Grant settles in for a siege. And on February 15th, the Confederates launch a massive breakout. It works. They punch a hole. The road to Nashville is wide open. And then, for reasons historians are still arguing about, they walk back into the fort and close the door behind them. That night, 2 of the 3 generals slipped away on steamboats and left the third one, Simon Buckner, holding the bag. Now here's the human part. Buckner and Grant were friends, West Point classmates. Years earlier, when Grant was broke and drinking, Buckner had loaned him the money to get home to his family. Buckner sent the surrender note expecting the gentleman's terms friends gave each other. Grant wrote back, and this is one of the great American military dispatches, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." 15,000 Confederates surrendered, the largest American military capture to that point. In 5 days, the Confederate line in the West collapsed. Nashville fell within 2 weeks, the first Confederate state capital to fall. Both rivers opened. The whole Western theater cracked. Northern papers went wild. They noticed the man's initials, U.S. Grant, spelled out the words, "Unconditional Surrender." The nickname stuck overnight. When rivals demanded Lincoln fire Grant for his drinking, his manner, his rumpled coat, Lincoln gave the answer history remembers: "I can't spare this man. He fights." After 8 months of paralysis in the East, a country starving for someone who would just move had finally found him. Remember the name, because in Part 3, Grant walks into a Tennessee field called Shiloh, and on the second day of the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, he becomes the future of the Union Army.
"6 months ago, when I made the first jump in this series, the country thought this was going to be a 90-day war. 90 days.
When Bull Run happened, the Confederacy had momentum. They had won the only major battle. They had a defensive line stretching from Virginia all the way across Kentucky and Tennessee. European powers were openly debating whether to recognize them as a country. The South genuinely believed one more big victory might end this thing in their favor. That's not the map anymore. In the Western theater, the Union just punched a hole through that defensive line in 5 days. The Tennessee River is Union water. The Cumberland is Union water. Nashville, the first Confederate state capital, has fallen. Kentucky is solidly in the Union column. Missouri is stabilizing. The entire Western Confederacy has just been split open by a man with a cigar and a wrinkled coat. But in the Eastern theater, nothing. The largest, best-equipped army in American history has been sitting in camp outside Washington for 8 months. Robert E. Lee, who started this period as a humiliated punchline, has had time to recover his reputation and is about to be given command of an army that doesn't exist yet. Richmond, 90 miles from Washington, has not been seriously threatened. That is the war right now. Brilliant in the West, frozen in the East. And here's the thing nobody on either side fully understands yet. The war they thought they were fighting is over. The polite 90-day gentleman's war died at Bull Run and got buried at Ball's Bluff and Fort Donelson. What's coming next is something neither side has built the imagination for yet.
Before you click away, up on the screen is the Part 1 video, the one that started this series. Be sure to leave me a comment and subscribe. I've got a lot of jumps to make. See you in Part 3.